Thomas and his German shepherd, Brave, stood in the cold morning rain before the house time forgot. Suddenly, Brave froze, ears perked, body like stone. In the porch's shadows, the dog didn't bark. He let out a whimper that sounded almost human. Kneeling down, Thomas found a rusted tin beneath the floorboards, a piece of his past waiting 30 years for his return. Inside wasn't a dark secret, but a whisper of love that never faded. This is a journey of mending more than just walls. It's a soul finding its way home, guided by 4 faithful paws. Before we start, where are you watching from? Drop your country in the comments and subscribe to join our family of stories. A silver mist clung to the jagged peaks of the valley, drenching the world in a relentless, bone-chilling drizzle that felt more like a memory than weather. The sky, a heavy sheet of bruised pewter, pressed down on the ancient pines, carrying the sharp scent of wet resin and the earthy, melancholic breath of wood rot that had been slumbering for decades. It was the kind of morning where the world seemed to hold its breath, waiting for a ghost to reclaim its place among the living. Thomas stood before the wrought iron gate, his tall, broad-shouldered frame silhouetted against the encroaching gray. At 45, he bore the rugged, weather-beaten look of a man who had survived storms both literal and metaphorical. His face was a map of hard-won experience, a sharp, angular jawline softened only by a thick salt and pepper stubble, and eyes the color of cold flint that seemed to look through reality rather than at it. He wore a heavy beige canvas jacket, the fabric stiff with age and stained by the red clay of distant lands, paired with dark charcoal chinos that were worn thin at the knees. There was a disciplined stillness in his posture, a remnant of his years as a combat engineer. Yet his hands, calloused, scarred, and capable of both immense destruction and delicate repair, trembled slightly as he gripped the rusted skeleton key. He was a man of mechanical genius, someone who saw the world as a series of interlocking gears, yet he stood here feeling like a broken spring in a forgotten watch. Beside him sat Brave, a majestic German shepherd whose presence was the only thing keeping Thomas anchored to the earth. Brave was 7 years old, a seasoned soul in a powerful body, his coat a thick tapestry of midnight black and burnished tan. A distinguished mask of silver gray had begun to creep around his muzzle, giving him the appearance of a wise old sage. His amber eyes were unnervingly intelligent, filled with a soulful depth that suggested he didn't just see the world, he understood its sorrows. Brave was a retired service dog, trained to detect threats, but in the silence of this valley, his mission had changed. He was now the guardian of Thomas's fragile peace. He didn't bark. He simply watched the house, his ears perked forward, his nostrils flared to catch the scent of the man's ancestral ghosts. The lock groaned, a metallic shriek that echoed like a dying bird through the silent woods, as Thomas pushed the heavy oak door open. He had expected to find a fortress, a place to wall himself off from the world's judgment, but as the threshold was crossed, he found only a hollow, aching void. The air inside was stagnant, tasting of chalk and forgotten winters. Dust motes danced in the thin, sickly light that managed to pierce through the grime-crusted windows, swirling like the spirits of 1,000 unspoken apologies. The house didn't feel like a sanctuary. It felt like a living creature that had been holding its breath for 30 years, waiting for someone to either wake it up or finally let it die. Thomas walked into the center of the living room, his boots leaving deep, reverent imprints in the thick carpet of dust. To his left sat a high-backed armchair, draped in a yellowed white sheet that made it look like a shrouded figure mourning in the corner. This was the throne of Silas, his father. Silas had been a man of immense strength and few words, a master carpenter whose hands always smelled of cedar and linseed oil. Thomas could almost see him there, a phantom with shoulders like oak beams and a voice like low thunder. Silas had built this house to last a century, every joint hand-cut, every nail driven with purpose. The guilt pooled in Thomas's stomach, cold and heavy as lead. He had inherited his father's gift for creation, but he had spent his youth using it to bridge chasms for tanks and reinforce bunkers for war. Standing here, he felt the crushing weight of a legacy he had neglected, a son who had returned only when he had nowhere else to fall. Brave moved with a calculated rhythmic grace, his claws clicking softly against the warped floorboards, a sound that felt like a ticking clock in the silence. He didn't explore with the curiosity of a puppy. He moved with the caution of a soldier clearing a room. He stopped abruptly in front of a stained section of the floral wallpaper, where a family portrait had once hung. The rectangular outline was still visible, a lighter shade of blue amidst the faded patterns, marking the spot where a younger, smiling Thomas had once stood between his parents. Brave let out a low, mournful whimper, a vibration of pure empathy that seemed to shake the very dust from the air. He pressed his wet nose against the cold wall, his tail hanging low, his body shivering. He was sensing the residual echoes of the love that had once warmed these walls, a warmth that had long since been replaced by the biting chill of a house that had forgotten how to be a home. The sound of Brave's grief broke the dam Thomas had spent years building. He knelt down, the fabric of his chinos stretching over his scarred knees, and buried his face in the thick, comforting fur of the dog's neck. For a long moment, the veteran allowed himself to simply exist, breathing in the scent of Brave, earth, pine, and living warmth, using it to drown out the suffocating smell of decay. The house seemed to sigh in response, a long, drawn-out creak of the rafters that felt like a release of tension. The wind rattled the window panes, a restless tapping that sounded like fingers begging for recognition. Thomas realized then that the house wasn't empty. It was filled to the brim with the things he had refused to carry. As he stood back up, the genius in him, that restless analytical part of his brain, began to flicker to life. He looked at the sagging ceiling and saw not just failure, but a structural puzzle waiting to be solved. He saw the way the light hit the dust and envisioned where the windows should be cleared to let the sun heal the wood. He reached out and touched a dusty side table, his finger tracing a long, clean line through the gray film to reveal the rich, dark mahogany underneath. It was a small gesture, but it was the first act of care the house had received in a generation. The morning light began to shift, turning from a sickly gray to a pale, watery gold as the clouds momentarily parted. It illuminated the dust motes, turning them into a shimmering veil of gold that hung between Thomas and the past. Brave looked up at him, his amber eyes reflecting the change, his posture now alert and expectant. The dog's breath puffed out in small, white clouds in the freezing air, a rhythmic sign of life in a place that had been declared dead. The house was no longer a tomb. It was a patient, and Thomas was the only one who knew the anatomy of its wooden heart. Thomas looked at his faithful companion and whispered a single word into the silence. Home. It wasn't just a destination. It was a vow. The Tengtodai sigh of the dust settled, and for the first time in 30 Nam, the house felt like it was finally breathing again, in perfect sync with the man and the dog who had come to save it. The pale amber light of dawn crawled across the scarred mahogany floor, illuminating the swirling dust motes that had finally begun to settle after a night of heavy, watchful silence. The mountain air, crisp and biting, seeped through the cracks in the window frames, carrying the scent of damp earth and the distant, rhythmic drumming of a woodpecker against a hollow pine. Inside, the house felt less like a tomb and more like an old, weary soldier slowly blinking his eyes open after a long hibernation. The oppressive weight of the previous evening replaced by the sharp, metallic tang of the cold grease and old wood. Thomas was already awake, his body having long ago abandoned the luxury of deep sleep. He sat on the edge of the dust-covered armchair, his tall frame hunched over, as he laced his heavy leather work boots with the practiced efficiency of a man preparing for a march. The flinty color of his eyes seemed more focused this morning, the haunted shadows under them, slightly receding beneath a layer of grim resolve. He wore a clean but faded indigo work shirt, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle and crisscrossed with white, hair-thin scars. Souvenirs from a life spent rebuilding bridges and dismantling threats in places the world preferred to forget. To those who didn't know him, Thomas might have appeared cold or unapproachable, a man of jagged edges and sharp silences. But in the quiet of this morning, there was a strange budding tenderness in the way he smoothed his hand over the arm of his father's old chair. Brave was already on patrol, his powerful German shepherd frame moving like a shadow through the corridors. He was 7 years old, but this morning he moved with the energy of a younger dog, his claws clicking a steady rhythmic beat against the oak floorboards. The silver mask around his muzzle seemed to shimmer in the low light, and his amber eyes remained fixed on Thomas, waiting for the signal to begin the day's labor. He didn't need words. The bond between them was built on years of shared breaths and silent watches. Brave knew that the home Thomas had whispered the night before wasn't just a word, but a mission. One that required the dog's keen senses as much as the man's technical mind. Just as Thomas stood to begin clearing the debris, a sharp, authoritative rap echoed against the front door. Brave was instantly alert, a low rumble of caution vibrating in his chest. But he didn't bark. The door creaked open to reveal a woman who looked as though she had been forged from the very granite of the surrounding peaks. This was Clara Sterling, a 72-year-old neighbor who had survived more winters in this valley than Thomas had years on Earth. Clara was short and sturdy, her silver hair pulled back into a braid so tight it seemed to sharpen her piercing sapphire eyes. Her skin was tanned to a deep, healthy bronze, etched with the fine lines of 1,000 smiles and just as many hardships. She wore a thick quilted vest over a red flannel shirt, and her hands, though wrinkled, were steady as she held a heavy thermos and a tin of warm biscuits. Clara had a reputation for being the iron rose of the valley, a woman of immense kindness who didn't suffer fools, and someone who had known Thomas's mother, Evelyn, better than anyone else alive. "I saw the light in the window last night, Thomas. I figured you'd either be starving or hiding," Clara said, her voice a warm rasp that carried the cadence of the mountains. She didn't wait for an invitation, stepping into the foyer with a familiarity that softened the house's jagged atmosphere. She looked around the dusty room, her gaze lingering on the empty spot on the wall where the family portrait once hung, and for a brief second, a flicker of profound sadness crossed her face. "You look like Silas, but you have Evelyn's hands. Use them well, boy. This house has been waiting a long time to hear a friendly voice." She left the coffee and biscuits on a cleared corner of the sideboard, offering Thomas a nod that was both a blessing and a challenge before disappearing back into the morning mist. Her visit was brief, but it left behind the scent of lavender and fresh yeast, a human touch that made the task ahead feel less like a penance and more like a rebirth. Fueled by the coffee and the weight of Clara's words, Thomas began his work in the parlor. However, Brave had other ideas. The dog was strangely fixated on a corner near the cold fireplace, his nose pressed deep into the gap between the floorboards. He began to paw at the wood, not with the frantic energy of a dog chasing a mouse, but with a deliberate, insistent pressure. Thomas watched him, his engineer's brain noting the way the dog's tail wagged in a slow, focused arc. He knelt beside his companion, noticing that one particular board sat slightly higher than the others, its edge notched with a small, intentional groove that only a carpenter or a genius would notice. Using a pry bar with the delicacy of a watchmaker, Thomas lifted the plank. There, nestled in a velvet-lined hollow, sat a small wooden box covered in a thick, gray shroud of cobwebs. As Thomas pulled it out, his breath hitched. It was a Swiss-made music box, its lid inlaid with intricate mother-of-pearl flowers that caught the morning light. This had been Evelyn's most cherished possession, a gift from Silas that had once filled the house with melody every Sunday afternoon. But 30 years of neglect had not been kind. The hinge was seized by rust, the wood was dangerously dry, and the internal mechanism felt like a frozen heart. To any other person, it was a piece of junk, but to Thomas, it was a mechanical soul in need of a miracle. He carried the box to the kitchen table, clearing a space with a reverence that bordered on the religious. He brought out a small kit he had carried through 2 tours of duty, a collection of precision screwdrivers, a bottle of fine instrument oil, and a soft cloth. The genius in him took over, his flinty eyes narrowing as he analyzed the seized gears. He worked in total silence for hours, his scarred fingers moving with a grace that contradicted his rugged exterior. He painstakingly cleaned each brass tooth of the comb, removed the oxidized grit from the governor, and applied the smallest drop of oil to the mainspring. Brave sat at his feet, his head tilted, his amber eyes watching every movement as if he understood that the silence of the house depended on this tiny machine. The tension in the room was palpable as Thomas finally turned the small brass key. At first, there was only a dry, metallic creak. Thomas didn't force it. He waited, his heart hammering against his ribs. He adjusted a tiny bent pin with a pair of tweezers, his hand as steady as a mountain. Then, he flipped the lever. A moment of agonizing stillness passed, and then, a single crystalline note rang out, followed by another, until the hauntingly beautiful melody of "The Blue Danube" began to dance through the dusty air. The notes were slightly weathered, carrying a nostalgic vibrato, but they were clear and defiant. Brave's ears perked straight up, and for the first time since they had arrived, he let out a soft, melodic ran-rai whimper that wasn't born of grief, but of pure, unadulterated recognition. He tilted his head from side to side, his tail thumping rhythmically against the floor in time with the music. The melody acted like a sonic broom, sweeping away the heavy, suffocating silence that had occupied the house for 3 decades. Thomas closed his eyes, and for a fleeting second, the smell of dust was replaced by the phantom scent of his mother's baking and the cedar shavings from his father's lathe. The house didn't feel like a ruin anymore. It felt like a living memory. As the music box played its final lingering note, a profound change settled over Thomas. The cold flint in his eyes had melted into something warmer, something that looked remarkably like hope. He realized that Clara was right. He had his mother's hands, hands meant for healing. He looked at Brave, who was now resting his chin on Thomas's knee, and felt a surge of gratitude for the silent animal who had led him to this moment. They weren't just fixing a house. They were conducting a symphony of restoration. The music box sat on the table, its mother-of-pearl flowers glowing in the sun, a small but mighty beacon of light in the heart of the valley. Thomas stood up, his posture straighter, ready to face the next challenge, knowing that the spirits of the house were finally, beautifully awake. The residue of the music box's melodies still seemed to vibrate in the floorboards as the third morning broke, but the sentimentality of the previous evening was quickly eclipsed by the harsh, utilitarian reality of the task at hand. Thomas stood in the center of the kitchen, his flinty eyes scanning the battlefield of his inheritance. The house was no longer just a memory. It was a fortress of filth, guarded by decades of stagnant dust and a legion of spiders that had claimed every corner of the high-vaulted ceilings. Thomas moved with a renewed, almost frantic energy, his charcoal chinos already smeared with white plaster dust, and his beige canvas jacket cast aside to reveal the corded, scarred muscles of his arms. He had spent the early hours of the dawn tinkering with an old, heavy-duty industrial blower he had found in the shed, a rusted beast of a machine that he had stripped down and reassembled with the surgical precision of a man who understood the language of airflow and torque. It was a genius modification. He had reversed the intake to create a localized cyclone, a tactical weapon designed to purge the house of its ghostly gray shroud once and for all. Before the first blast of air could be unleashed, a bright yellow pickup truck rattled up the gravel driveway, its engine groaning in protest against the steep incline. From the driver's side stepped Sarah Miller, the 34-year-old owner of the valley's only hardware supply store. Sarah was a woman of striking, lean proportions, standing nearly as tall as Thomas himself, with a posture that radiated a restless, no-nonsense competence. Her strawberry blonde hair was pulled back into a high, swinging ponytail that caught the morning light like spun copper, and her skin was a mosaic of sun-kissed freckles and a deep, healthy tan earned from years of hauling lumber and loading grain. She wore a pair of well-worn denim dungarees over a simple white tank top, her arms surprisingly strong and defined, with a light dusting of sawdust usually clinging to her skin. Sarah was known for her sharp tongue and an even sharper mind. She had taken over her father's business after a tragic logging accident left him paralyzed, and she had run it with an iron fist and a soft heart ever since. She watched Thomas with a mixture of skepticism and a hidden, deep-seated respect, her vibrant emerald eyes taking in the weary veteran and his formidable dog. "Clara told me you were back, but she didn't mention you were planning on starting a one-man war against the dust of 1995, Sarah called out, her voice a clear, resonant alto that cut through the mountain stillness. She began unloading several heavy-duty respirators and a crate of industrial-grade cleaning solvents from the bed of her truck. Thomas offered a curt, respectful nod, his jaw tightening slightly. He wasn't used to help, nor was he comfortable with the watchful eyes of a stranger, but he recognized the practical necessity of the supplies. Sarah didn't wait for a thank you. She simply set the crates on the porch and leaned against the railing, watching as Brave approached her with a slow, measured curiosity. Brave, ever the discerning judge of character, sniffed her boots, caked in the mud of the valley, and let out a low, approving huff before leaning his heavy head against her leg. "He's a good judge of people, Thomas," Sarah remarked softly, her eyes softening as she scratched behind Brave's ears. "Don't work yourself into an early grave. This house has a way of fighting back." With a final lingering look at the man who seemed to be trying to rebuild his soul with a wrench, she climbed back into her truck and departed, leaving behind a lingering scent of cedar and diesel. With the supplies secured, Thomas donned his respirator, looking more like a specialized soldier than a renovator. He signaled Brave to a safe distance on the porch, but the dog refused to abandon his post. Sitting firmly by the open door, his amber eyes wide with anticipation, Thomas pulled the starter cord on the blower. The machine roared to life with a deafening guttural howl that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cottage. He aimed the nozzle at the heavy velvet curtains in the parlor, curtains that had hung undisturbed since the day his mother had last drawn them. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. A massive billowing cloud of gray-white dust erupted into the air. A ghostly mist so thick it obscured the walls within seconds. It was a whiteout, a localized blizzard of debris, spider webs, and disintegrated fabric that turned the interior of the house into a swirling, ethereal dreamscape. Through the haze, Brave became a figure of unintentional comedy. The dog, usually a model of military-grade dignity and poise, found himself in the direct path of a secondary air current. Within minutes, the thick midnight black fur of his back and the burnished tan of his underbelly were completely coated in a layer of fine white powder. Long, sticky strands of ancient spider webs clung to his ears and muzzle like a tattered, ghostly veil. He looked like a spectral hound, a ghost dog, appearing and disappearing within the white mist. Brave shook himself, sending a fresh explosion of dust into the air, but the webs remained stubbornly attached to his whiskers, giving him a confused, almost elderly expression that was entirely at odds with his powerful frame. He sneezed, a loud, wet achoo that echoed off the bare walls, and pawed at his nose, only to succeed in tangling a fresh cluster of dust bunnies into his fur. The battle moved to the dining room, where a pile of old cardboard boxes sat in a precarious stack near a lopsided hutch. As Thomas directed the torrent of air toward the corner, a small, scrawny ginger tabby cat, a stray that had clearly made the ruins its home, bolted from behind the boxes. It was a pathetic-looking creature, perhaps 3 years old, with tattered ears and a coat that had seen better days, though its eyes were a fierce, defiant gold. Brave, his instincts overriding his confusion, let out a sharp woof and gave chase. However, the dust-clogged air made the floorboards as slick as ice. As Brave lunged after the tabby, his large paws lost their grip. He slid across the hardwood like a clumsy skater on a frozen pond, his legs splaying out in 4 different directions. He tried to course correct, but his momentum was too great, and he went sliding headfirst into the stack of empty cardboard boxes. The crash was magnificent. Boxes tumbled in every direction, burying the ghost dog under a mountain of flattened brown paper and old newspapers. For a moment, there was a stunned silence, broken only by the fading whine of the blower as Thomas switched it off. Then, a single dusty ear poked out from beneath a box labeled Kitchen 1990. Brave emerged slowly, looking utterly defeated, with a newspaper clipping from the previous century stuck to his forehead. He looked at Thomas with an expression of such profound, wounded dignity that the armor around the veteran's heart finally cracked. Thomas began with a low, rusty chuckle, a sound he hadn't heard in so long it felt foreign in his own throat. But then, the absurdity of the situation, the white-coated dog, the web-covered house, and the spectacular failure of the chase took hold. Thomas threw his head back and laughed. It wasn't a quiet giggle. It was a deep, soul-cleansing roar that filled the empty rooms and echoed out into the valley. He laughed until his chest ached, and tears carved clean tracks through the dust on his cheeks. He laughed for the boy who had played in these rooms, for the man who had suffered in the dirt of foreign lands, and for the simple, ridiculous joy of a dog who had tried to be a hero and ended up a mess. Brave, hearing the sound, shook the newspaper from his head and trotted over, his tail beginning to wag in a rhythmic thud, thud, thud against the floor. He leaned against Thomas's legs, leaving a massive white smudge on the man's charcoal chinos, and let out a happy, sharp bark. The house, once a place of oppressive silence and heavy shadows, now felt light. The white ghosts had been purged, leaving behind bare walls and a clean slate. Thomas reached down and rubbed Brave's dusty head, the laughter subsiding into a quiet, peaceful smile. He realized that the battle hadn't just been against the dust. It was against the darkness that had settled into his own spirit. As the dust slowly settled, revealing the true bones of the home, Thomas felt a strange, budding sense of optimism. Sarah was right. The house fought back, but it also rewarded those who were brave enough to face its ghosts. He looked at the scrawny ginger cat, which was now watching them safely from the top of the hutch, and decided that there was room in this new life for more than just ghosts. The war was far from over, but for the first time in 20 years, Thomas felt like he was on the winning side. The celebration of laughter from the previous day had evaporated with the morning frost, replaced by the stark, unforgiving reality of a house that possessed a soul but lacked the basic sustenance of life. While the white ghosts of dust had been banished, the pipes remained as dry as bone, and the old well at the edge of the property was a silent, clogged throat choked by decades of silt and fallen leaves. Thomas stood by the kitchen sink, his flint-colored eyes narrowing as he disassembled the rusted faucet with a precision that bordered on the obsessive. He was a man who understood the fundamental laws of pressure and flow, a genius of the mechanical world who could diagnose a failing engine by the mere vibration of its casing. Yet here, the solution required more than just a wrench. It required a primitive, earthbound engineering, a return to the basics of survival that he had mastered in the muddy trenches of foreign lands where technology was a luxury and nature was the only provider. He wore his signature dark charcoal chinos, now stained with the iron-rich mud of the valley, and his sleeves were rolled high, exposing the intricate silvery network of scars that ran like jagged rivers from his wrists to his elbows. These were not just marks of combat. They were the blueprints of his survival, the physical record of a man who had been broken and rebuilt as many times as the machines he loved. As Thomas began to map out a gravity-fed filtration system, a low, rhythmic thumping echoed from the gravel path. It wasn't the heavy truck of Sarah or the light step of Clara, but the slow, deliberate gait of a man who carried the weight of the mountains in his joints. Barnaby Barney. Thorne emerged from the mist, an 80-year-old retired forest ranger who looked like a gnarled hemlock tree that had somehow learned to walk. Barney was a man of immense quiet gravity, his frame lean and bowed, but his spirit remained as sharp as a winter frost. He had a magnificent, untamed beard, the color of wood ash that reached his chest, and his skin was a deep, translucent bronze, etched with countless wrinkles that seemed to hold the history of the valley's secrets. His eyes, a fading gray like a storm-tossed sea, held a weary kindness. He wore a heavy wool Mackinaw jacket and carried a large burlap sack that smelled sharply of scorched earth and hardwood. Barney had been Silas's closest friend, the man who had taught Thomas how to read the wind and find the hidden springs when he was just a boy. And he had spent his long retirement in a cabin higher up the ridge, surviving on silence and memories. The water in this valley is sweet, Thomas, but it's stubborn. It doesn't like being caged in iron pipes, Barney said, his voice a deep, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate in the very air. He set the heavy sack down on the porch with a dull thud. I brought you some hardwood charcoal, oak and maple, burned slow and hot. It's the only thing that can scrub the bitterness of 30 years out of a cistern. Thomas offered a silent nod of profound gratitude, a rare moment of connection that didn't require the clumsy interference of words. Barney didn't offer a hand to help. He knew that for a man like Thomas, the work was the medicine. He simply sat on the porch railing, lighting a pipe that filled the air with the scent of cherry tobacco, and watched with a watchful, paternal eye as the veteran and his dog prepared for the task. Barney's presence was a bridge to the past, a silent observer of the legacy being unearthed, his very existence a testament to the resilience Thomas so desperately sought. The plan was a masterclass in improvised engineering. Thomas decided to bypass the modern, corroded filters and build a multi-stage natural purification system inside the stone cistern. He spent the next several hours at the edge of the creek that cut through the back of the property, his boots sinking into the icy sludge as he searched for specific types of stones. Brave was at his side, his majestic German shepherd frame bristling with purpose. To involve his companion, Thomas had fashioned a pair of improvised saddlebags from heavy canvas scraps, draping them over Brave's powerful back. The dog understood the mission with an unnerving clarity. As Thomas gathered large, smooth river stones, the foundational layer of the filter, Brave stood perfectly still, his amber eyes watching the man's hands. When the bags were full, the dog would trot back to the house, his muscles rippling beneath his midnight black and tan coat, navigating the treacherous, muddy incline with a disciplined grace that shamed the clumsy efforts of a human. By midday, the labor began to take its toll. The river stones were heavy, and the sand was even heavier, requiring dozens of trips back and forth between the creek and the house. Thomas refused to pace himself, driven by a feverish need to see the water run clear. He dug through the silt of the cistern with a shovel and his bare hands, the cold mud numbing his skin. His old scars, those jagged reminders of explosions and shrapnel, began to burn and throb under the strain. As he hoisted a particularly heavy bucket of gravel into the stone tank, the skin across his knuckles and wrists stretched to the breaking point. The old, thin tissue of the scars began to weep, small droplets of dark crimson mixing with the gray mud on his arms. He didn't stop. He couldn't. The pain was a distraction from the hollowness in his chest, a physical sensation that proved he was still capable of feeling something other than regret. He was building something that would last, something that would provide, and every drop of blood felt like a necessary sacrifice to the house his father had built. Brave noticed the shift in Thomas's energy immediately. The dog dropped his latest load of stones and approached the cistern, his tail hanging low in a sign of intense concern. He didn't bark or whimper. Instead, he stepped into the mud beside Thomas, pressing his warm, solid shoulder against the man's leg. It was a silent, grounding force, a reminder that Thomas wasn't alone in this war of restoration. Brave nudged Thomas's hand with his wet nose, his amber eyes reflecting a depth of loyalty that seemed to transcend the boundaries of species. The dog's presence was a stabilizer, a rhythmic force that encouraged the veteran to slow his breathing. Thomas looked down at his bleeding hands and then at his faithful friend, the ghost dog, who had stayed by him through every nightmare. A quiet, shaky breath escaped his lips, and he allowed himself a single minute of rest, leaning his head against Brave's neck. The scent of the dog, earth, rain, and life was the only scent that mattered in that moment. The final stage was the layering. Thomas worked with a delicate intensity, placing the river stones at the bottom, followed by a thick layer of the smaller pebbles Brave had helped transport. Then came the coarse sand he had washed 3 times in the creek, and finally, the crowning layer of Barney's hardwood charcoal. He calculated the flow rate in his head, adjusting the density of the sand to ensure the water would permeate slow enough to be cleansed, but fast enough to meet the house's needs. It was a symphony of layers, a geological filter designed by a genius and built by a soldier. Barney watched from the porch, his pipe having long since gone out, a faint, proud smile hidden behind his massive white beard. He saw the way the man and the dog moved in unison, a single unit of labor and love, their bodies caked in mud, but their spirits aligned. As the sun began to dip behind the jagged peaks, painting the sky in bruises of purple and gold, Thomas climbed out of the cistern and walked to the kitchen. His hands were wrapped in clean white bandages, a stark contrast to his dark charcoal chinos, but his flinty eyes were bright with anticipation. He gripped the rusted faucet handle, his breath hitching in his throat. He turned it. At first there was only the familiar, hollow gurgle of air through the pipes, a sound of empty promises. But then, a shuddering vibration ran through the plumbing, a rhythmic thumping that felt like the house's heart coming back to life. A dark, muddy sludge sputtered out at first, the residue of 30 years of neglect. But as the seconds ticked by, the flow stabilized. The water turned from brown to a cloudy gray, and then, with a sudden joyful rush, it became crystal clear. It splashed against the porcelain sink with a crisp musical ring, the light catching the sparkling purity of the mountain spring. Thomas reached out and cupped the water in his bandaged hands, feeling the icy, refreshing sting against his skin. He brought it to his lips, tasting the cold, sweet essence of the valley, a taste that carried no bitterness, only the promise of a new beginning. He filled a bowl and placed it on the floor for Brave, who lapped at the water with a satisfied enthusiasm, his tail thumping against the floorboards. Outside, Barney stood up, nodded a silent farewell, and vanished into the darkening woods, his mission complete. The house was no longer thirsty, and as Thomas looked at his reflection in the clear water, he realized that for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't looking at a ghost. He was looking at a man who was finally learning how to build a home from the wreckage of his scars. The triumph of the crystal clear water flowing through the kitchen tap had brought a fleeting sense of peace to the house. But the mountains surrounding the valley were ancient and possessive, and they did not give up their secrets or their resources without a price. By the stroke of midnight, the celebratory silence of the cottage was shattered by a sound that felt less like a mechanical failure and more like a groan from the earth's own weary bones. Thomas was jolted from a light, uneasy sleep by the vibration, a rhythmic subterranean thrumming that shook the floorboards beneath his cot. Beside him, Brave was already standing, his ears pulled back and a low, sustained growl vibrating through his powerful chest. The air in the room had changed. It had grown heavy and humid, smelling of deep-seated silt and the metallic tang of an underground river. Thomas grabbed his heavy industrial flashlight, his flint-colored eyes sharp with an immediate soldier-like clarity as he followed the sound toward the narrow, steep stairs that led into the basement, the dark belly of his father's house. As he swung the cellar door open, the beam of light revealed a nightmare. The foundation built by Silas with such pride 30 years ago was under siege, a massive underground vein of water, pressurized by the recent heavy rains and redirected by the very repairs Thomas had made to the cistern, had forced its way through a fissure in the limestone bedrock. It wasn't just a leak. It was a geyser of icy, mud-choked water that was rapidly transforming the basement into a dark, swirling lake. The water had already risen to his knees, and more disturbingly, the pressure was beginning to undermine the main support beam, a massive oak pillar that held the weight of the entire parlor above. Thomas realized with a gut-wrenching dread that if the soil beneath that beam washed away, the house wouldn't just be damaged, it would settle, crack, and eventually slide into the hollows of the mountain. He was a man who had seen the destruction of bridges and the collapse of bunkers, but the thought of losing this fragile sanctuary, the only physical piece of his parents he had left, sent a jolt of raw adrenaline through his system. "Stay up there, Brave," Thomas commanded, his voice echoing off the damp stone walls. But for the first time in their years together, the dog hesitated to obey a direct order. Brave stood at the top of the stairs, his amber eyes reflecting the frantic movement of the water below. He could sense the danger, the shifting of the earth, and the icy lethality of the mountain runoff. Thomas didn't have time to argue. He stripped off his beige canvas jacket, standing in a simple black undershirt and his charcoal chinos as he waded into the freezing depths. The water was so cold, it felt like 1,000 needles piercing his skin, a bone-deep chill that threatened to seize his muscles. He reached the support beam and began to work with a desperate genius-level intuition. He needed to create a cofferdam, a temporary barrier to redirect the flow and stabilize the base of the pillar before the subsidence became irreversible. In the midst of this midnight struggle, a new figure appeared at the top of the cellar stairs, peering through the shadows with a mixture of awe and terror. This was Leo, a 14-year-old boy from the neighboring farm, who had been sneaking onto the property for days, drawn by the legend of the genius veteran and his ghost dog. Leo was a scrawny, lithe teenager with a mop of unruly, dark chestnut hair and large, inquisitive eyes the color of moss. He wore an oversized, tattered flannel shirt and work boots that were 2 sizes too big, giving him a perpetually disheveled underdog appearance. Leo was a quiet child, a dreamer who spent more time in the woods than in a classroom, and he had a reputation in the valley for being lost in the clouds after his older brother had left for the city and never returned. He carried an old brass hurricane lamp, his small hands shaking as he witnessed the titanic struggle occurring in the dark water below. He wanted to help, to prove himself to the man he secretly admired, but he was paralyzed by the scale of the disaster. "Leo, get the sandbags from the porch! Now!" Thomas roared, his voice cutting through the roar of the rushing water. The boy jumped, startled into action, and vanished into the darkness. But the flashlight Thomas had been using slipped from his wet, numb fingers, plunging the basement into a suffocating, absolute blackness. In that void, the sound of the water became a predatory growl, and Thomas felt the first true wave of panic. He was blind, freezing, and struggling against a force of nature that cared nothing for his engineering or his grief. Then, a beam of golden light sliced through the dark. Brave had descended the stairs, not to join Thomas in the water, but to serve as his sentinel. The dog had picked up the heavy, rubberized industrial flashlight in his mouth, his powerful jaws gripping the handle with a disciplined, unwavering strength. He stood on the third stair from the bottom, the only part of the staircase still above the rising flood, and directed the light exactly where Thomas was working. The sight of those amber eyes behind the beam of light was the only fuel Thomas needed. Brave's head moved with a rhythmic, mechanical precision, tracking Thomas's every move, ensuring the light never wavered from the base of the beam, where Thomas was now piling heavy stones, and the sandbags. Leo was frantically sliding down the stairs. The dog's loyalty was a physical presence, a warm light in a cold, dark world. For 3 grueling hours, Thomas remained submerged to his waist in the icy water, his bandaged hands from the previous day's labor reopening, his blood mixing with the mountain silt. He shoved, heeched, and anchored, using his knowledge of hydraulic pressure to create a diversion channel that led the water toward a natural drain in the far corner of the cellar. Every time his muscles cramped or his spirit began to flag, he looked up to see Brave, steady as a statue, the light held high like a sacred torch. Leo worked alongside them from the stairs, his small frame straining as he hauled the last of the bags. The boy saw the silent communication between the man and the dog, a bond that didn't require words, a perfect synchronization of purpose that seemed to defy the chaos of the night. It was a lesson in resilience that no book could ever teach him. He saw Thomas, a man who had every reason to let the house go, fighting for it with a ferocity that was almost mythological. As the first gray light of dawn began to seep through the cellar vents, the geyser finally began to subside, redirected into the new channel Thomas had painstakingly built. The pressure against the oak pillar eased, and the ground beneath it held firm. The house had been saved, not by a miracle of technology, but by a miracle of will and the unwavering light of a faithful companion. Thomas finally climbed out of the water, his body shaking with uncontrollable tremors of hypothermia. He collapsed onto the bottom step, his skin a deathly shade of blue, and his clothes heavy with mud. Brave immediately dropped the flashlight and was at his side, his large, warm body pressing against Thomas's chest, his tongue licking the salt and silt from the man's face. The dog's coat was wet from the spray, but his internal furnace provided the only heat Thomas could find. Leo stood on the stairs, holding his lamp, looking at the two of them with a newfound reverence. He realized then that Thomas wasn't just a genius or a soldier. He was a man who knew that a home was something you fought for, especially when the world tried to wash it away. "You did good, kid," Thomas whispered, his voice cracked and raw. Leo beamed, a bright, hopeful smile that transformed his moss-colored eyes. The boy felt like he belonged to something important for the first time in his life. Thomas reached out a trembling hand and rested it on Brave's head, the dog's fur thick and grounding beneath his palm. The underground vein had been tamed, its destructive energy turned into a controlled flow that would now serve the house rather than destroy it. As the sun finally rose over the jagged peaks, painting the valley in hues of rose and gold, The basement remained flooded, but the foundation was secure. The ghost dog had brought the light, and the genius veteran had held the ground. They were battered, bruised, and exhausted, but they were still standing. The house breathed a long, echoing sigh of relief, and in that moment, the veins of destiny felt less like a curse and more like the lifeblood of a future they were building together, one midnight battle at a time. The sky turned a bruised, sickly purple as the gale-force winds began to howl through the narrow valley, tearing at the ancient pines. Thunder shook the very marrow of the mountains, and a torrential rain began to hammer against the tin roof like a barrage of relentless, invisible bullets. The fragile peace Thomas had built after the flood was shattered as the pressure in the atmosphere dropped, mirroring the sudden, violent tightening in his own chest. He had been in the parlor, attempting to reinforce a window frame, when the first true crack of lightning split the sky, illuminating the room in a strobe light flash of ghostly white. The sound that followed was not just thunder. To Thomas, it was the guttural roar of heavy artillery. Every rattle of the loose roofing sheets became the metallic clatter of machine gun fire, and the smell of wet ozone transformed into the acrid, choking scent of cordite and burning diesel. His genius mind, usually a sanctuary of logic and mechanics, suddenly short-circuited, plunging him into a recursive loop of memory, where the walls of his childhood home melted into the mud-slicked walls of a trench. He felt the cold, familiar weight of terror pressing down on his lungs, a phantom pressure that made every breath feel like he was inhaling shards of glass. Thomas stumbled away from the window, his flinty eyes wide and unseeing, his calloused hands trembling so violently that he dropped his hammer, the dull thud lost in the cacophony of the storm. Before the darkness could fully claim him, a heavy, familiar weight moved into his peripheral vision. Captain Elias Vance had arrived just as the first clouds gathered, a man who lived like a hermit on the northern ridge and had seen the storm coming in the ache of his old bones. Elias was 75, a retired Marine, who carried himself with the rigid, unbreakable dignity of a flagstaff. He was a wiry man, his frame hardened by decades of mountain life, with a shock of snow-white hair that stood in stark contrast to his deeply tanned, leathery skin. His most striking feature was an eye patch over his left eye, a relic of a forgotten skirmish, while his remaining eye, a sharp and steady hazel, seemed to possess a calm that could quiet a riot. He wore an old military surplus poncho that smelled of wood smoke and wet wool, and he moved with a slow, deliberate cadence that refused to acknowledge the chaos of the wind. Elias had known Thomas's father, Silas, and he had seen the 1,000-yard stare enough times to recognize a man who was fighting a war that had long since officially ended. He didn't offer empty words or frantic comfort. He simply placed a heavy, grounding hand on Thomas's shoulder for a fleeting second, a silent acknowledgement of the quiet war they both fought, before heading to the kitchen to boil a pot of strong, bitter chicory coffee. But as the storm reached its zenith, the wind screaming through the eaves like a choir of the damned, Elias's presence wasn't enough to hold the shadows at bay. Thomas had retreated to the darkest corner of the parlor, his back pressed against the cold stone of the fireplace, his knees pulled to his chest in a desperate attempt to make himself a smaller target. He was shaking, a rhythmic bone-deep tremor that no blanket could cure. In his mind, he was back in the mud, the screams of his brothers lost in the thunder, the world ending in fire and rain. He was a broken machine, his gears stripped, his spirit caught in a terminal spin. The genius veteran was gone, replaced by a terrified boy who had seen too much of the world's cruelty. The house, usually his project of restoration, now felt like a cage, the groaning timbers sounding like the tortured screams of the fallen. Brave had been watching Thomas from the center of the room, his amber eyes filled with a profound diagnostic concern. The German shepherd didn't bark. He knew that noise was the enemy tonight. He moved with a slow, purposeful grace, his powerful body navigating the shadows, until he stood directly in front of Thomas. He saw the man's unseeing eyes, the way his breath came in shallow, ragged gasps, and he recognized the scent of the dark place, a smell of cold sweat and ancient fear. Brave didn't hesitate. He didn't wait for a command he knew Thomas was incapable of giving. The dog moved his massive, warm body into the narrow space, pressing his chest directly against Thomas's ribs. He leaned his heavy head onto Thomas's shoulder, his burnished black and tan fur acting as a shield against the freezing air of the room. Brave was a biological anchor, a living weight designed to pull a drowning soul back to the surface of reality. The effect was not immediate, but it was inevitable. Thomas felt the heat of the dog's body through his thin shirt, a solid, unwavering presence that refused to be shaken by the storm. He felt the steady, rhythmic thrumming of Brave's heart, a slow, calm beat that provided a counter rhythm to the frantic, erratic pounding of his own. It was a symphony of survival, a heartbeat of pure, uncomplicated loyalty that acted as a metronome for Thomas's fractured mind. Thomas's hands, still shaking, instinctively reached out, burying themselves in the thick, coarse fur of Brave's neck. He focused on that sensation, the texture of the hair, the warmth of the skin beneath, the solid muscle of the animal who had never once judged his weakness. Slowly, agonizingly, the sounds of the battlefield began to fade, replaced by the heavy, comforting breathing of the dog. The invisible bullets on the roof became just rain again, and the artillery became merely the natural anger of the clouds. Elias watched from the doorway, the steam from 2 tin mugs of coffee rising in the dim light. He saw the man and the dog silhouetted against the dying embers in the hearth, a singular unit of resilience. He had seen many things in his 75 years, but the sight of Brave's quiet devotion brought a rare moisture to his hazel eye. He knew that for men like Thomas, the greatest enemy wasn't the storm outside, but the one within, and Brave was the only sentinel capable of standing guard at that particular gate. Elias walked over, moving as quietly as a shadow, and set the mugs on the dusty floorboards near them. He sat down a few feet away, leaning his back against the wall, his presence a secondary layer of protection. He didn't speak, knowing that silence was the only language Thomas could process right now. They sat there for hours, 3 survivors of different wars, while the gale tore at the world outside. As the first gray sliver of dawn began to creep over the jagged peaks, the storm finally spent its fury. The wind subsided into a weary moan, and the rain turned into a gentle, rhythmic patter that sounded like a benediction. Thomas's breathing had finally synchronized with Brave's. The tremors had ceased, replaced by a heavy, restorative exhaustion. He opened his eyes, the flint-colored depths now clear and present, reflecting the pale gold of the morning light. He looked at Brave, who was still pressed tightly against him, his amber eyes watchful and tired, but filled with an ancient, unwavering love. Thomas realized that he hadn't just survived the storm. He had survived the memory of the storm. He wasn't alone in the trenches anymore. He was in his father's house, and he had a guardian who would never let him be lost again. Thomas reached out and touched Elias's hand, a brief, firm squeeze that carried more weight than 1,000 thank yous. Elias nodded, his eye patch shadowing half his face as he stood up, his joints popping like dry twigs. "The mountains are quiet today, Thomas," Elias said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "And the house is still standing. That's enough for one night." He picked up the empty mugs and walked toward the door, his silhouette a testament to the strength of those who endure. Thomas watched him go, then turned his attention back to Brave. He stood up, his posture straighter than it had been in years, his spirit mended by the simple, powerful act of a dog's heartbeat. They walked to the porch together, breathing in the scent of wet pine and washed stone. The white ghosts were gone, the flood had retreated, and the gale had been conquered. The genius veteran and his faithful dog were no longer just fixing a house. They were building a fortress of the soul, one heartbeat at a time. The morning air arrived with a crisp, crystalline clarity, scrubbed clean by the previous night's gale. A thin veil of frost sparkled on the hemlock needles, and the sun, a pale disk of hammered gold, rose slowly behind the jagged granite peaks, casting long amber fingers across the valley floor. The world was quiet, draped in the scent of wet stone and resurgent pine. Thomas sat at the heavy mahogany table in the kitchen, his flinty eyes fixed on a small stack of crumpled receipts and an empty ledger. The reality of his restoration was beginning to bite with a cold, metallic hunger. His meager savings, intended to last through the winter, had been swallowed by industrial cleaners, piping, and specialized tools. He was a man of mechanical genius, capable of seeing the hidden potential in a rusted engine, Yet even he could not conjure lumber out of thin air, and the sturdy oak doors required to secure the house against the coming snows were far beyond his current reach. He leaned his head into his calloused hands, the scars on his knuckles still pink and tender from his battle with the basement flood. The silence of the house, once oppressive, now felt expectant, as if the very walls were waiting to see if he would crumble alongside his bank account. Brave sat at his feet, his powerful German shepherd frame radiating a quiet, focused energy. The dog nudged Thomas's knee with his cold nose, his amber eyes bright with a sudden, sharp intelligence. Brave didn't offer a whimper of comfort. Instead, he stood up and walked to the back door, his tail giving a single, authoritative thump against the floorboards. He looked back at Thomas, his ears perked and his posture alert, before letting out a short, demanding bark that echoed through the empty hallway. It was a summons, a call to the wild spaces beyond the porch that Thomas had yet to fully explore. Trusting the animal's intuition, Thomas grabbed his beige canvas jacket and followed Brave out into the shimmering, frost-bitten woods that rose like a green wall behind the cottage. They hiked deep into the heart of the ridge, far beyond the narrow trails Thomas remembered from his youth. The forest here was ancient and possessive, a cathedral of shadow and moss where time seemed to move at the speed of a growing root. After nearly an hour of trekking through the dense undergrowth, Brave stopped abruptly at the edge of a hidden ravine. He began to dig at the frozen earth near a massive, silver-gray mound that looked, at first glance, like a weathered rock. As Thomas approached, he realized it was a fallen giant, a great white oak that had been toppled by a storm decades ago. The bark was gone, replaced by a smooth, bone-like patina, and it was half buried in a tomb of emerald moss and fallen leaves. To a casual observer, it was merely rot and ruin, a ghost of the forest waiting to return to the soil. However, as Thomas knelt and struck the trunk with the butt of his hunting knife, the sound that returned wasn't the hollow thud of decay, but a sharp, high-pitched ping of incredible density. His genius mind immediately began to calculate the age and quality of the specimen. This was heartwood, the inner sanctum of the tree that had been naturally seasoned by 30 years of mountain winters and summer heat. The tannins had preserved it, turning the grain into something as hard as iron and as beautiful as polished marble. It was a treasure hidden in plain sight, a forgotten legacy of the earth that mirrored his own fractured existence. As he was inspecting the oak, a low, rhythmic creak of wagon wheels announced a visitor from the deeper shadows of the woods. Gideon Blackwood emerged from the mist, leading a massive soot-colored mule named Homer. Gideon was 84 years old, the local sawyer, and a man who looked as though he were composed entirely of knotted hemp and old leather. He was remarkably lean, his spine straight despite his age, and his face was dominated by a pair of deep-set, hawk-like eyes that held a fierce, unsettling clarity. His beard was a wild, short-cropped tangle of iron gray, and his hands were gnarled and stained dark by a lifetime of walnut oil and sawdust. Gideon was a man who spoke in riddles of timber and grain, a recluse who lived in a cabin made entirely of salvaged souls, trees that others had deemed useless. He was a man of few smiles, his temperament hardened by a tragedy in his youth when a forest fire had claimed his family's original mill, leaving him with a profound respect for what survives the flames. "You've found the king oak, Thomas," Gideon said, his voice a dry, rasping whisper that sounded like sandpaper on cedar. He patted Homer's sturdy flank, the mule letting out a weary, knowing huff. "Your father and I watched this one fall in the big blow of '92. He always said it was too good for the fire, but too heavy for a man to carry alone." Thomas looked at the old sawyer, recognizing the silent offer of alliance. Gideon didn't offer charity, he offered craftsmanship. He helped Thomas rig an improvised sled from a pair of fallen birch poles and heavy climbing rope, using his ancient mule to provide the brute strength required to move the massive trunk. Thomas worked alongside them, his muscles screaming under the strain, his charcoal chinos caked in the rich black loam of the forest floor. He and Brave acted as the outriders, guiding the heavy load through the narrow gaps in the trees, a singular unit of man, dog, and beast. Back at the cottage, the real work began. Thomas transformed the porch into a temporary workshop, his genius for mechanics allowing him to adapt his father's old handsaws and planes to handle the iron-hard oak. For 3 days, the air was filled with the sweet, intoxicating scent of seasoned wood and the rhythmic shick-shick of steel meeting grain. He worked until his eyes burned with exhaustion, and his fingers were stained dark by the oak's high tannin content. Brave was a constant sentinel, often helping by bracing smaller planks with his heavy paws or carrying tools in his mouth, his amber eyes never leaving Thomas's moving hands. The dog seemed to understand the sanctity of the work, his presence a stabilizing force that kept the veteran's mind from wandering back to the dark trenches of his past. As Thomas planed away the weathered gray exterior, the true soul of the wood was revealed, a deep, honey gold grain with medullary rays that looked like shimmering flakes of sunlight trapped in amber. He realized that the scars of the wood, the knots where branches had been torn away, and the deep fissures from the freezing winters, were the very things that gave the timber its character and strength. He fashioned 2 massive doors, each one hand-joined with mortise and tendon joints that required no nails, only the perfect alignment of the wood itself. He wasn't just building a barrier against the cold. He was mending the broken pieces of his own history, using the very things the world had forgotten to create something indestructible. By the evening of the 4th day, the first door was hung. It swung on its rusted, cleaned hinges with a silent, heavy grace, closing with a thud that echoed like a heartbeat through the house. The wood glowed in the firelight, its golden surface a testament to the beauty of resilience. Thomas stood back, his chest heaving, his hands stained but steady. Gideon sat on the porch steps, his pipe lit, watching the veteran with a rare, approving nod before disappearing back into the woods with Homer. The old Sawyer hadn't charged a cent, knowing that the king oak had finally found the hands it was meant for. Thomas reached down and ruffled Brave's ears, the dog leaning his weight against the man's leg. The financial burden hadn't vanished, but the fear of the future had. He had learned that the most valuable treasures aren't bought with coin, but unearthed with sweat and a keen eye for the potential in the discarded. He looked at the sturdy, beautiful door, and then at his faithful companion. They were no longer just survivors of the storm. They were the architects of a new life. The house was secure, the wood was strong, and for the first time in 30 years, Thomas felt like he was finally standing on a foundation that would never break. The golden oak doors Thomas had hung now stood as silent sentinels, shielding the interior from the lingering mountain chill. But as the first true breath of spring whispered through the valley, the house itself seemed to demand a different kind of restoration. In the quiet hours of a Sunday morning, while the mist still clung to the hollows like a tattered silk veil, Thomas sat at the mahogany table he had painstakingly polished, surrounded by a collection of yellowed, brittle envelopes he had found tucked into a hidden compartment of his mother's sewing box. These were the letters Evelyn had written, but never sent, addressed to a version of Thomas that had long since been swallowed by the smoke of distant wars. As his flint-colored eyes moved over the elegant, looping script, he didn't find accusations or demands. He found a detailed, poetic map of a garden that had once been her sanctuary. She spoke of larkspur that captured the color of the summer sky, of heirloom roses with the scent of old honey, and of a specific patch of earth beneath the kitchen window where the sunlight lingered longest. To Thomas, these letters were more than just correspondence. They were a set of blueprints for a living monument, a way to apologize to the woman whose funeral he had missed because he was guarding a bridge in a country that no longer existed on the map. The garden, however, was currently a graveyard of briars and suffocating ivy, a chaotic tangle of gray thorns and skeletal remains of what had once been a paradise. Thomas stepped onto the porch, his charcoal chinos already damp from the dew, carrying a rusted spade and a heavy heart. He was a man who understood the rigid logic of steel and the uncompromising strength of oak, but the delicate, unpredictable nature of the earth felt foreign to him. He looked at his hands, the calluses thick, the scars from the cistern battle still faint pink lines across his knuckles, and wondered if hands that had spent 20 years dealing in destruction could ever learn the gentleness required to nurture life. Brave was already ahead of him, his powerful German shepherd frame moving with a strange, reverent delicacy among the weeds. The dog seemed to sense the change in the atmosphere. his amber eyes scanning the overgrown plot, with a focus that suggested he was looking for more than just rabbits or moles. He was searching for the heartbeat of the land, the hidden pulse that his mother had described so vividly in her silent words. As Thomas began the grueling work of clearing the briars, a small bird-like figure appeared at the edge of the property, her presence announced by the rhythmic clink-clink of a metal trowel against a ceramic pot. This was Marisol Vance, the 68-year-old younger sister of Captain Elias Vance, and a woman who was rumored to be able to talk the very stones into blooming. Marisol was a stark contrast to her rugged brother. She was tiny and graceful, with skin the color of polished mahogany and a shock of curly, lavender-tinted hair that escaped from beneath a wide-brimmed straw hat. She wore a pair of emerald-green gardening overalls over a faded tie-dye shirt, her pockets overflowing with packets of seeds and dried herbs. Marisol was a retired botanist who had spent decades traveling the world, only to return to the valley to care for the discarded spirits of the local flora. She had a mischievous, knowing smile and eyes the color of steeped tea that seemed to see right through Thomas's stoic exterior. She had been Evelyn's closest confidant in the years after Silas passed, and she carried the secrets of this soil in the marrow of her bones. "You're digging too deep, Thomas," Marisol said, her voice a light, melodic trill that sounded like a songbird in the pines. She didn't wait for a greeting, stepping into the garden with a practiced ease that made the thorns seem to part for her. Evelyn never fought the earth. She danced with it. "You're treating this like a trench, but it's a cradle." Thomas paused, his spade mid-air, the sweat dripping from his angular jawline. He offered a respectful nod, recognizing the woman who had once taught him how to distinguish a harmless garter snake from a threat. Marisol walked to the center of the plot and pointed her trowel at a particularly stubborn patch of ivy. "The roots here are deep, but they are tired. They aren't trying to keep you out. They're trying to hold on to what's left of her." She handed Thomas a small glass vial of essential oils and a bag of bone meal, her touch as light as a dragonfly's wing. "Gardening isn't about control, son. It's about listening. If you listen to the soil, it will tell you what it needs to heal." Her presence brought a soft, nurturing energy to the property, a counterbalance to the masculine intensity of Thomas's labor. And as she moved among the weeds, she hummed a low tune that seemed to settle the restless energy of the valley. The work continued for days, the physical exertion acting as a form of meditation for Thomas. He cleared the briars, tilled the soil, and added the nutrients Marisol had provided, his genius for detail, allowing him to recreate the exact layout described in the letters. But it was Brave who made the most significant discovery. Late on the fourth afternoon, as the sun began to cast long, violet shadows across the mountain, the dog began to dig with a sudden frantic intensity in a corner near the old stone well. Thomas watched, ready to scold him for disturbing the freshly tilled earth. But Brave's behavior was different than usual. He wasn't chasing a scent. He was uncovering something with a surgical precision. After several minutes, the dog backed away, his tail giving a single triumphant wag, as he revealed a small, rusted iron box, no larger than a man's palm, buried beneath the roots of a dead rose bush. Thomas knelt in the dirt, his charcoal chinos caked in mud, and pried the lid open with a trembling hand. Inside sat two simple, elegant gold wedding bands, his parents' rings, and a single, large, obsidian-colored seed that felt unnaturally heavy in his palm. It was a starhearth seed, a rare and legendary mountain lily that was said to only bloom in places where deep love and deep sorrow had met and reconciled. It was a final gift, a tangible piece of the past that Evelyn had hidden away, perhaps knowing that one day her son would need a reason to stay. As Thomas held the rings, the cold metal warming against his skin, he felt a sudden, sharp pang of connection that transcended the decades of silence. He realized then that the garden wasn't just a tribute to his mother. It was a conversation between the people they had been and the people they had become. He planted the mysterious seed in the center of the plot, right beneath the kitchen window, using his bare hands to press the soil down. He worked until the moonlight turned the garden into a silver dreamscape, his fingers stained black by the earth, the old scars on his hands finally beginning to feel like a natural part of his skin rather than a record of his pain. As the weeks passed and the first true warmth of spring took hold, a tiny, vibrant green sprout began to push its way through the dark soil. It was a fragile, defiant sliver of life, no larger than a fingernail, but it held the strength of the entire mountain within it. The moment Thomas saw it, he felt something within his own chest give way. A tightening of the heart that had been present since his first deployment finally began to loosen. It was as if his own internal wounds were finally scabbing over, the new skin of his soul growing underneath the protection of the labor. The garden began to transform. The larkspur reached toward the sky, the roses began to bud with a promise of honey, and the starhearth lily grew with a rapid, ethereal grace. Brave became the garden's silent protector, often napping near the sprout as if his warmth could accelerate its growth. Thomas spent his evenings on the porch, watching the breeze move through the leaves, realizing that he was no longer a visitor in this valley. He was a part of it. The Garden of Souls had become a bridge, a place where the whispers of the dead met the breath of the living, and where a broken veteran and his faithful dog found the only kind of peace that truly mattered. He looked at his hands, no longer seeing the destruction they had wrought, but the life they had helped to summon. The house was restored, the water was clear, the doors were strong, and now the earth itself was singing. As the first petal of the mystery, Lily began to unfurl, revealing a deep, midnight blue, Thomas realized that he hadn't just planted a garden. He had finally allowed himself to be planted back into his own life. The first heavy snow of December arrived with a hushed velvet grace, draping the jagged peaks in a pristine white shroud and turning the valley into a world of muffled silence and crystalline beauty. Inside the cottage, the air no longer tasted of stagnant dust or forgotten sorrows. Instead, it was a rich, aromatic symphony of beeswax, freshly planed cedar, and the sharp, comforting scent of cinnamon sticks simmering on the restored cast-iron stove. Thomas stood in the center of the parlor, his flint-colored eyes reflecting the warm, golden glow of the hearth fire he had built from the scraps of the king oak. The house was finished, not just repaired, but reborn. Every joint was tight, every floorboard sang with a deep, polished resonance, and the sturdy oak doors he had fashioned stood as testament to his journey from the wreckage of the past to the sanctuary of the present. He wore a clean wool sweater, the color of a forest at dusk, over his dark charcoal chinos, his movements fluid and relaxed, the frantic intensity of the previous months replaced by a quiet, grounded pride. His calloused hands, once used only for the rigid precision of war, had spent the last few weeks crafting smaller, gentler things, tiny bird sanctuaries with intricate gabled roofs and sturdy mailboxes with hand-carved motifs of mountain laurels, which he had silently delivered to Sarah, Clara, and Barney as tokens of a gratitude he still found difficult to voice. Brave was the first to sense the arrival of the evening's visitors, his powerful German shepherd frame draped across the soft rug in front of the fireplace, his ears perking toward the snow-muffled gravel path. He didn't growl. Instead, he let out a low, welcoming huff and trotted to the door, his tail giving a rhythmic, happy thud against the wood. Tonight was Christmas Eve, and for the first time in 30 years, the house was not a fortress of isolation, but a beacon of light. Thomas had spent the previous week reaching out to those the world often chose to forget, the silent men and women who lived in the shadows of their own memories, the veterans who, like him, had found the return home to be the longest march of their lives. He had hung hundreds of handmade candles in glass jars from the eaves and the garden fence, turning the property into a shimmering island of amber light in the vast, blue-black sea of the winter night. The first to emerge from the swirling snowflakes was Henry Hank Miller, a 72-year-old former artilleryman who lived in a small, weathered cabin at the edge of the lower creek. Hank was a man built like a weathered stone wall, short, stocky, and deceptively strong, with a shock of wiry white hair that refused to be tamed and a thick, bushy beard that looked like steel wool. He had lost the hearing in his left ear and a finger on his right hand to an explosion 40 years ago, and he carried himself with a slight defensive crouch, as if always expecting a sudden impact. Hank was notoriously gruff, a man of few words who preferred the company of his old radio to people, but as he stepped into the warmth of Thomas's parlor, his sharp, pale blue eyes misted over. He wore an old, meticulously patched field jacket, and his hands trembled slightly as he handed Thomas a jar of home-brewed elderberry wine. Hank had spent many Christmases alone, the silence of his cabin a double-edged sword. But tonight, the smell of the house and the sight of Brave's wagging tail seemed to pull him back from the precipice of his own solitude. Shortly after Hank arrived, the door opened again to admit Ollie Thorne, a man in his early 30s who was the grandson of Barney Thorne. Ollie was a veteran of more recent conflicts, and unlike the older men, his wounds were entirely invisible, but no less profound. He was tall and painfully thin, with sunken, haunted eyes the color of rain, and a nervous habit of constantly checking the exits of any room he entered. His dark hair was buzzed short, and he wore a worn military surplus parka that seemed too big for his frame, as if he were trying to disappear inside it. Ollie had struggled with a persistent, paralyzing anxiety since his return, finding the noise of the town to be an unbearable assault on his senses. He stood in the foyer, his posture rigid and his breathing shallow until Brave approached him. The dog didn't lunge or bark. He simply walked up and leaned his heavy, warm shoulder against Ollie's leg, looking up with an amber gaze that held a universe of understanding. Ollie's hand crept out of his pocket, his fingers burying themselves in Brave's thick fur, and Thomas watched as the younger man's shoulders finally dropped an inch, the physical connection to the animal acting as a lightning rod for his frantic energy. The evening was a quiet, profound celebration of shared survival. Thomas had prepared a simple, hearty feast: roasted root vegetables from the garden, a slow-cooked venison stew, and bread that Sarah had brought over earlier that day. They sat around the mahogany table, the candlelight casting long, flickering shadows on the walls, and for a long time, the only sound was the clinking of silverware and the crackle of the fire. They didn't talk of the wars they had fought or the horrors they had seen. Instead, they talked of the grain of the wood, the taste of the spring water, and the way the star-hearth lily in the garden had survived the first frost. Thomas acted as the silent conductor of the evening, his mechanical genius now focused on the social engineering of peace, ensuring that no one felt pressured to speak, but no one felt ignored. He saw Hank's gruff exterior soften as he shared a story about his own dog from years ago, and he watched Ollie finally begin to eat, the younger man's eyes losing their frantic darting quality as he focused on the rhythmic breathing of Brave, who had taken up a permanent station at his feet. As the clock neared midnight, Thomas led his guests onto the porch. The storm had passed, leaving behind a sky so clear the stars looked like diamonds scattered on black velvet. The Garden of Souls was transformed under the moonlight, the snow sparkling like dust from a fallen star. In the center of the plot, the star-hearth lily was in full ethereal bloom, a deep midnight blue flower that seemed to emit its own faint, pulsing light. It was a miracle of resilience, a living proof that even in the coldest, darkest winter, something beautiful could thrive if it was given enough care and hope. They stood in a line on the porch, 3 generations of veterans, their silhouettes a testament to the strength of those who endure. The candles Thomas had placed around the garden flickered in the soft breeze, creating a path of light that stretched toward the woods. Brave sat in the middle of them, his breath forming small, white clouds in the freezing air, his head held high. He was the bridge between them, the silent witness who had seen them at their worst and loved them anyway. Thomas reached out and rested his hand on Brave's head, feeling the solid, grounding heat of the dog's skull. He realized then that the feast of light wasn't about the food or the house. It was about the compassion that allowed them to see themselves in each other. The scars on his hands no longer felt like brands of shame. They were the marks of a builder, a healer, and a host. He looked at Hank and Ollie, and in their tired, peaceful faces, he saw the reflection of his own redemption. The house behind them was no longer a place of ghosts. It was a home. The water was clear, the doors were strong, the garden was alive, and for the first time in his life, Thomas felt that the genius he possessed was not for fixing machines, but for mending the broken threads of human connection. As the final candle in the garden flickered out, leaving only the starlight and the glow of the lily, Thomas whispered a silent prayer of thanks to the parents who had left him this foundation. The war was over, the storm had passed, And in the quiet of a mountain Christmas, the veteran and his dog had finally found the peace they had been searching for through all the mud and the shadows of the world. The sun descended toward the jagged amethyst peaks of the valley, spilling a flood of liquid amber across the landscape. This was the golden hour, a time when the world seemed to hold its breath in a state of grace, and the mountains themselves glowed with the soft, burnished patina of an old wedding ring. Thomas sat on the porch in a heavy oak rocking chair he had crafted with his own hands from the remnants of the king oak. His tall frame relaxed, his long legs stretched out in his signature dark charcoal chinos. He wore his beige canvas jacket, though it was now clean and smelled of cedar shavings and linseed oil, rather than the acrid scent of distant battlefields. His flinty eyes, once sharp with the hypervigilance of a soldier, had softened into the reflective depth of a craftsman who had finally learned the value of a slow, steady gaze. He watched the light play across the garden of souls, where the Starhearth lilies had multiplied, their deep blue petals shimmering like fallen pieces of the twilight sky. The house behind him was no longer a project. It was a living, breathing entity, a sanctuary of warmth where the pipes hummed with clear spring water and the sturdy doors stood as guardians of his hard-won peace. Beside him, Brave lay in his habitual place, his powerful German shepherd frame draped across the warm floorboards. The dog had begun to show the inevitable signs of his 8 years. The silver mask around his muzzle had widened, and his movements were slower, characterized by a dignified, rhythmic grace. His amber eyes remained as intelligent as ever, but they held a new, tranquil depth, the look of a sentinel who had successfully completed his longest mission. Brave's breathing was steady and deep, a peaceful counterpoint to the rustle of the evening breeze in the pines. He no longer felt the need to patrol the shadows. He had sensed the change in the house, the shift from a place of ghosts to a place of belonging. He was the sage dog now, the silent witness to Thomas's alchemy of the soul, his presence a constant grounding heat that reminded the veteran that he was never truly alone. The silence of the evening was gently broken by the approach of a small, energetic figure running up the gravel path, followed by the steady, rhythmic stride of Sarah Miller. This was Mia Miller, Sarah's 8-year-old daughter, a vibrant child who seemed to carry the sun in her laughter. Mia was a miniature version of her mother, with a wild mane of strawberry blonde curls that refused to be tamed, and a face covered in a constellation of dark freckles. She wore bright yellow overalls and muddy boots, her green eyes wide with a boundless, inquisitive wonder. Mia was a child of the valley, a soul who spent her days chasing butterflies and learning the names of the mountain herbs from Marisol Vance. She was the first of the next generation to claim a stake in Thomas's sanctuary, seeing him not as a genius veteran or a broken man, but as the toy maker of the woods. Behind her, Sarah moved with her usual lean, effortless competence, her copper ponytail swaying as she carried a basket of freshly picked autumn apples, her emerald eyes reflecting a quiet, enduring respect for the man Thomas had become. "Thomas! Thomas! Did the wind chime you made for the birds sing today?" Mia called out, her voice a bright, melodic trill that echoed through the porch. She skidded to a halt in front of Brave, who didn't stir but gave his tail a single, welcoming thump against the wood. Mia knelt and buried her small hands in the dog's thick fur, a gesture of pure, uncomplicated love that made Thomas's heart tighten with a gentle, unfamiliar warmth. Thomas offered a rare, genuine smile, his angular jawline relaxing. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, hand-carved wooden bird, a tiny blue jay made from a scrap of mahogany, and handed it to the girl. "It sings when the mountains want to speak, Mia," he said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. Sarah reached the porch and set the basket down, her gaze sweeping over the restored cottage with a sense of shared triumph. "The house looks like it's always been this way, Thomas," she remarked softly, like it grew out of the earth itself. As Sarah and Mia eventually departed, their laughter fading into the deepening twilight, Thomas retreated into the interior of the house. The parlor was bathed in the soft, flickering glow of the fireplace, the scent of wood smoke acting as a benediction. He walked to the kitchen and ran his fingers along the smooth, polished surface of the mahogany table. the wood feeling like warm skin beneath his calloused palm. He realized then that the true heritage of warmth his parents had left him was not found in the bricks he had reset, the pipes he had cleared, or even the beautiful oak doors he had hung. The real legacy was the intangible strength they had buried deep within his spirit, the capacity to endure, the will to mend, and the quiet, stubborn courage required to rebuild a life from the fragments of a shattered past. Silas had given him the hands of a builder, and Evelyn had given him the heart of a healer, and it had taken 30 years of storm and shadow for him to understand how to use them together. Thomas sat by the fire, Brave's head resting heavily on his knee, the dog's warmth seeping through his charcoal chinos. He thought of the white ghosts of dust they had fought, the midnight battle against the flood in the cellar, and the terrifying gale that had tested the anchors of his mind. Each struggle had been a necessary layer in the foundation of his new life, a process of tempering that had turned his soldier's flint into something more resilient and light. He looked at the music box on the sideboard, its abalone flowers glowing in the firelight, and the crystalline notes of the Blue Danube seemed to echo in his mind, no longer a mournful cry of the past, but a joyous symphony for the present. The genius in him was no longer a burden of cold logic. It was a gift of creation, a way to weave the broken threads of the world back into a tapestry of hope. The night deepened, the stars appearing in the velvet blackness above the valley like ancient watchful eyes. Thomas felt a profound sense of closure, a realization that the war within him had finally reached a permanent ceasefire. He was no longer a ghost haunting a ruins. He was a custodian of a Daesan, legacy, a man who had found his way home through the four paws of a faithful friend and the echoes of his parents' love. He realized that a house is only a structure of wood and stone until it is filled with the warmth of shared stories and the breath of those who remain. He looked down at Brave, whose amber eyes were closed in a deep, trusting sleep, and he knew that as long as they had each other, the darkness of the world would never again find a foothold in this valley. The chapter and the long march of his return concluded not with a grand gesture, but with a quiet, rhythmic peace. Thomas closed his eyes, his breathing synchronizing once more with the dog at his side, the heat from the hearth enveloping them like a heavy golden blanket. The house was finished, the garden was in bloom, and the spirit was mended. He was Thomas, the veteran, the genius, and the son, and he was finally, irrevocably, home. The heritage of warmth was not something he had merely found. It was something he had become. The sun had set on the ruins of his past, but the moon was rising over a future he had built with his own scarred, capable hands, one heartbeat at a time. The journey of Thomas and Brave is more than a story of restoring an old house. It is a profound testament to the resilience of the human spirit. From the white ghosts of dust to the golden light of the star-hearth lily, we witnessed a broken veteran find the courage to face his deepest shadows. Through every heavy stone carried and every rusted gear mended, Thomas learned that our past scars are not marks of shame, but the very blueprints of our strength. In a world that often discards what is old or broken, this story reminds us that nothing is ever truly beyond saving. Whether it is a sagging roof, a neglected garden, or a weary heart, there is a genius within all of us, the capacity to love, to build, and to heal. Community, as shown by the kindness of Sarah, Clara, and Barney, is the quiet glue that holds our lives together. When we open our doors and our hearts, we realize that we are never truly walking alone. May this story inspire you to look at the ruins in your own life not as an end, but as a beautiful foundation for a new beginning.